In December 1975, famed oceanographer Jacques Cousteau attempts to locate the wreck of the ocean liner Britannic, lost in a mysterious explosion back in 1916. After days of fruitless searching through the eastern Mediterranean, they finally pinpoint their prize, just off the island of Kea in 400 feet of water.
What amazed historians when Cousteau went out to visit the wreck is its remarkable state of preservation. Because as soon as a ship sinks, it starts to deteriorate. Britannic still almost looks the same as she did the day she sank.
The explorers hope that the wreck can provide answers to the many mysteries surrounding the day Britannic sank. What struck her? Why did she go down so fast? Was she carrying a secret cargo that led to her demise? Cousteau and his divers are cautiously optimistic. Perhaps the expedition can help write the final chapter in the tale of Britannic and her famous sisters. The grand superliners Britannic, Olympic, and Titanic are born in the first decade of the 20th century, a time when great ocean liners rule the world.
The world of ocean liners in 1910 was feasting on a westbound tide of immigrants. And that's indeed the reason why ships were so big on the North Atlantic. Not because they were splendid or luxurious, but because they wanted to provide room for this apparently unceasing flow of immigrants anxious to leave the old world for the new.
While the flood of immigrants makes the ship owners rich, the flow will not last forever. For most immigrants, the voyage to America is a one-way, once-in-a-lifetime trip. A more certain income comes from wealthy first-class passengers who make regular transatlantic crossings for both business and pleasure. The rich and famous also provide invaluable publicity. To attract these customers, ocean liner companies such as Cunard and White Star furiously compete to build bigger, faster, and more luxurious ships.
The competition between the various steamship lines was intense. When Lusitania was introduced in 1907, it gave Cunard a distinct advantage over White Star because not only was she the newest, she was the largest, she had more amenities than any other ship in the world. She attracted the wealthy and the influential from both continents.
Lusitania has another advantage over the competition. She is the greyhound of the seas. After her second voyage, the Lusitania claims the Blue Riband Trophy, awarded for the fastest transatlantic crossing. She makes the 3,300-mile trip in 4 days, 19 hours, and 52 minutes.
White Star were really in a bit of trouble when the Lusitania and Mauretania came into service. Up until then, they'd always had the largest, most luxurious ships on the North Atlantic. All of a sudden, along come Cunard, they got the largest, the fastest, the most luxurious ships, and straight away their fleet looks rather tarnished by comparison, so they had to respond.
In an attempt to break Cunard's stranglehold on the luxury market, Joseph Bruce Ismay, chairman of the rival White Star Line, and shipbuilder Lord William Peary boldly envision a new class of fantastically grand ships.
The White Star Line decided that they would go one better. In terms of size and luxury, they never went for speed. The White Star Line didn't care about speed. They were quite content to leave that to Cunard. What they did care about was having extremely large ships, and at 45,000 tons, the Olympic-class ships, as they were called, were far and away the largest in the world.
Even the ship's proposed names evoke images of superiority.
It's never been established conclusively. No one's ever found Bruce Ismay's diary and said, aha, I conceive a great trinity of ships, Olympic, Titanic, Gigantic. But it seems reasonable to assume that Gigantic was the name that was slotted for the third of the three sisters. It comes from Greek mythology. The Olympians were the triumphant gods, the Titans were the vanished gods, and the giants were the mythological creatures that sided with the wrong side in that war and were banished as well.
The first two of these ships, Olympic and Titanic, begin their lives in specially outfitted slips in the Belfast, Ireland shipyards of the Harland and Wolff Company. It is the first time that two ships of so great a size are built together.
They were built side by side at the same time, which was an amazing feat considering that when large ships are built, most steamship companies farm the work out to different yards. So for Harlan and Wolff to be able to build these two mammoth ships at the same time and have them on schedule was an amazing feat.
The Olympic is the first of the two massive ships to be completed, launching from the Belfast shipyards on October 20th, 1910. More than 100 feet longer than her nearest rival, Olympic easily claims the title of the world's largest ship.
The sheer spaciousness of these vessels really cannot be overemphasized. When you look at earlier ships, like the Lusitania and Mauretania, they're almost like play toys. Olympic and Titanic really heralded in the age of the superliner.
They had extravagant space inside, which gave them facilities which had never been seen before. For instance, down at the bottom of the main staircase, there was a reception room, which was anticipated the dining room.
They had a gymnasium, they had Turkish baths, they had palm courts, Parisian cafes, which did very well to attract all the influential passengers away from Cunard and give White Star the lion's share of the market.
Ismay, the White Star's chairman, is ecstatic with his new ship's reception. Thousands of onlookers rush down to the docks just to look at Olympic, amazed by her size and opulence. Among the crowds, a 23-year-old stewardess named Violet Jessup fights her way to the gangplank. She is part of Olympic's hand-picked crew.
I got a fresh thrill every time I went through Olympic's beautiful staterooms, with their exquisite woodwork and sumptuous silk furnishings. I have always maintained that never before or since have such materials of so perfect a quality been used to fit out any ship.
Olympic's maiden voyage goes wonderfully. In New York, Ismay excitedly cables the ship's builder, Lord Peary, with a congratulatory message. Olympic is a marvel and has given unbounded satisfaction. Olympic's beauty is more than skin deep. State-of-the-art safety features, including electrically driven watertight doors, make her one of the safest ocean liners ever to set sail. The respected magazine, Shipbuilder and Marine Engineer, goes so far as to declare the Olympic-class ships practically unsinkable, a haunting designation which the White Star Line will soon come to rue.
I think White Star did come to regret the term practically unsinkable, but it wasn't really their fault. In actual fact, White Star or Harlan and Wolff never made any such claim. They never said it was practically unsinkable.
Accidents and collisions are as old as the sea. They'll be with us forever. And there's no way that a ship can be unsinkable any more than a building can be completely fireproof.
Olympic nearly learns this lesson on her fifth voyage. Sailing through the narrow channels outside Southampton, the ship is overtaken by a Royal Navy armored cruiser, HMS Hawke. As they pass, the skipper of the Hawke is horrified to find that his controls are suddenly rendered useless, and his vessel drawn uncontrollably into a collision with a mammoth ocean liner.
The Olympic was blamed for the accident, said they were going too fast in confined waters, but there had been previous accidents in Southampton between warships and liners. The warships tended to be rather dashing. They got too close to these big ships without realizing the enormous suction that draws a small ship into the side of a large one moving at speed.
Hawke's bow rips through the side of the Olympic, slicing open a group of second-class cabins. Miraculously, no one is killed. The collision occurs at lunchtime, when most of the passengers are safely seated in the dining area. Both ships are crippled but manage to limp back to port for repair. The incident is quickly forgotten, until a year later when an eerily similar incident befalls Olympic's younger sister on her maiden voyage. When we continue, the accident that nearly saves Titanic from her rendezvous with an iceberg.
Would that they had hit, because then the maiden voyage would have ended with a whimper in Southampton rather than a bang off Cape Race.
The White Star liner Olympic receives considerable damage in her freak collision with a Navy cruiser. It takes hard-working shipwrights 6 weeks to complete the repairs and return the ship to duty. On April 10, 1912, Olympic is preparing to depart from New York on her regular run when her long-anticipated twin, Titanic, first sets sail.
The great neglect of publicity for the Titanic's entry into service. This was the second of the class. The Olympic had had all the cream of the publicity the year before. This was number 2 coming into service, and there were no pictures of her.
Titanic's lack of publicity doesn't stop her reputation for luxury from spreading by word of mouth. The rich and famous rush to fill the passenger list, eager to be the first to sail on the new ship. To ensure that these special guests receive the impeccable service that they demand, White Star Line Chairman Bruce Ismay employs a unique strategy.
Because Olympic and Titanic were so similar in design, they were basically cookie-cutter ships. When time came for Titanic to make her maiden voyage, a lot of the crew for her was transferred from Olympic to make the maiden voyage go smoother, to make the passengers happy. A lot of the passengers on Titanic had sailed on Olympic so frequently, they wanted to be waited on by the same crew, the same waiters, the same dining room stewards who had served them on Olympic.
First-class stewardess Violet Jessup eagerly makes the transition from the Olympic to the new ship. She cannot wait to explore the many small improvements that have been incorporated in Titanic's amenities.
We enthused over the then quite novel idea of small private decks for the best suites, the superb lace bedspreads we each had in our sections. We marveled at the masterpieces of wood carver's art from Ireland and Holland. Surely there was nothing missing to satisfy the long list of distinguished names on the first-class passengers list.
Titanic departs from Southampton, England on April 10, 1912. Ironically, her maiden voyage almost ends before it can begin. In an episode reminiscent of the collision between the Olympic and the Hawk, Titanic barely makes it away from the dock, which is crowded with other liners.
These other ships were rafted, as it was called. They were tied up side by side. And 2 of them, the Oceanic and the New York, were tied up on the dock peninsula right where the channel narrows. Titanic left the ocean dock, proceeded down past these 2 ships too fast. Exactly the same captain and the same pilot on the bridge. And the New York broke loose from her moorings. All 6 mooring lines snapped. She drifted to within 4 feet of the stern of the Titanic before one of the 6 tugs that had been taking Titanic out got a line on the stern and pulled it clear.
Only through luck is this collision averted, but at least one of Titanic's passengers murmurs that it is an ill omen. What might have happened had Titanic collided with the New York and been forced to return to port?
Would that they had hit, because then the maiden voyage would have ended with a whimper in Southampton rather than a bang off Cape Race. So it's one of that chain of what-ifs. There are so many heartbreaking near misses with the story of the Titanic. One of the reasons it makes it such an enthralling story about which people can't seem to get enough information.
On April 14, 1912, Titanic meets her doom when she collides with a huge iceberg and sinks in less than 3 hours. Remarkably, Violet Jessup is among the survivors of the disaster.
We went up on deck and were just standing back, watching a young officer trying to persuade emigrants to go into the boats. And as he could not make himself understood, he asked us to give a good example and get in. That is the reason why I am alive today.
She survived. She managed to get into a lifeboat on the Titanic. She held a baby all night, passenger left on the deck of the Titanic. Then she got on the Carpathia, and out of the crowd on deck came the mother. She'd reached the Carpathia by another lifeboat. So she took the child back, and she never thanked Violet. She never did. Curious.
Violet Jessup is one of only 700 people to survive the wreck of the Titanic. More than twice as many souls perish in the cruel, icy waters of the North Atlantic. 500 miles away, Olympic is one of the first ships to receive the frantic distress calls from her sinking sister. She is too far away to render aid. The horrible reality of the Titanic disaster sends shockwaves through the shipping industry. Olympic is immediately pulled from service and refitted in an attempt to make her even safer.
After the sinking of the Titanic, White Star made a number of changes to the Olympic. Not all of them really could be justified. A lot of them were simply public sops. so that the general public wouldn't feel quite as ill at ease traveling on this literal replica of the Titanic. The watertight bulkheads were extended up 20, 30 feet, sometimes all the way up to the weather deck. Additional lifeboats were put in, and that was truly necessary.
In the next slip, the partially built hull of the third Olympic-class ship receives the same modifications. In addition to internal improvements, workmen design and build huge davits on the decks that hold 46 boats. Measuring 34 feet each, the lifeboats are the largest ever fitted on a ship and possess ample space to carry the full complement of passengers and crew. After rigorous testing and inspection, the third sister is finally deemed seaworthy, with one last change.
I think they changed the name because gigantic might have been perceived as pretentious, as though tempting fate. That sort of showing off had gone out of style once Titanic went to the bottom. So they called it Britannic instead.
The Britannic officially launches on February 26, 1914. White Star Line officials are anxious to have her join the Olympic on the popular transatlantic route. But history intervenes. A world war is about to erupt, which will forever alter the course of Titanic's remaining sisters. When we continue, the crew of Britannic faces a horrible choice. Which way to die?
The explosion was the bow, and the bow was sinking, and lifeboats that were lowered on the side of the ship and let go were being drawn into the propellers and being chopped up.
1915. The White Star liner Britannic is still being prepared for her maiden transatlantic crossing when war breaks out between Germany and the Allied nations of France, Russia, and Great Britain. Britannic's voyage is immediately canceled, casting a shadow over the new ship's future.
During the First World War, the only way to get a great number of people from one place to another was by ship. So you had to press these ocean liners into military service as either troop transports or hospital ships to bring the wounded back to Britain.
The British Navy begins commandeering the Grand Ocean liners, and the Olympic is pressed into service as a troop transport. Since her sister Britannic is still in the shipyard, it is decided that she will be retrofitted for duty as a hospital ship. Britannic's beautiful furniture and artworks are replaced by surgical equipment and beds for 3,300 patients. Viewing his new home for the first time, the ship's surgeon declares that Britannic is the most wonderful hospital ship that ever sailed the seas.
Britannic had been fitted out exactly like Olympic and Titanic. She had all this elaborate carved paneling, she had these beautiful public rooms, and all the people on board, the nurses and the doctors and the patients, are living in a sort of an empty but still splendid ocean liner.
Britannic enters military service on December 23, 1915. Unbelievably, the indomitable Violet Jessup soon joins the crew. Having survived collisions on both the Olympic and Titanic, Jessup volunteers for military duty and is assigned to the third sister.
I would have thought, given her track record, that if people who knew her saw her boarding the Britannic, would have said, here comes that wretched Jonah, I'm getting off the ship. But she was doing her job. She was sent where she was assigned, and she happened to be put in harm's way 2.5 times, so to speak.
Early in the war, Allied forces are mired in a disastrous battle for control of Turkey's Gallipoli Peninsula. Britannic becomes part of the Dardanelles service, evacuating the endless stream of wounded soldiers flowing from the Mudros military hospitals on the Greek island of Lemnos.
Mudros was a very central point as far as all the British fronts were concerned. It was a major point where all the wounded could be collected, and ships like the Britannic could come in, pick up survivors from one point, and then travel back home.
The narrow straits of the Mediterranean present a hazardous passage. German U-boats stalk silently, ready to torpedo unsuspecting ships. Even more insidious are the mines they plant just below the surface of the water. Impossible to detect, these booby traps represent a random, deadly threat to any ship plying the waters.
The only protection that a hospital ship really had against attack was its color scheme. There were white hulls with a long green band from bow to stern that was interspersed with 3 red crosses. And this paint scheme did fairly well. There were a lot of German submarine captains who had seen these hospital ships and decided not to attack because of the various conventions and treaties that had been signed.
Both sides officially adhere to the rules of the Geneva Convention, which state that hospital ships are protected from attack, as long as they follow certain guidelines. Besides the medical staff for that ship, only wounded, unarmed soldiers are allowed on board, and they must exchange their uniforms for distinctive blue hospital suits. Britannic occasionally bends the rules by transporting non-combatant Army medical reinforcements to and from the front. While not a direct violation of the Geneva Convention, the action could easily be misconstrued if observed by the enemy. Regrettably, the extra passengers are witnessed in October 1916 by an Austrian citizen named Adalbert Messany, who is being expatriated from Egypt back to his homeland.
Unfortunately, while Messany was on board, he claimed to have seen a number of infringements of the Geneva Convention. Troops being transferred from Britannic with packages, a couple of troops on board who claimed to be interpreters and not injured at all. And when he got back to Austria, he wasn't slow to report these possible infringements to the authorities.
There were rumors that she was carrying munitions because she was entering a battlefield. There are questions about whether or not she was carrying troops on board.
These rumors will take on increasing importance in light of the events that surround Britannic's next voyage. November 21st, 1916 is a clear, beautiful morning as Britannic steams through the Kea Channel en route to pick up wounded patients in Greece. Suddenly, a massive explosion shatters the placid dawn. In the galley, the impact startled Violet Jessup.
Suddenly, there was a dull, deafening roar. As one man, the whole saloon rose from their seats, as men dropped what they were doing and jumped over presses with the agility of deer. This contrasted so forcibly with my recollections, not so far distant, of Titanic's night of doom. The unhurried calmness with which we then confronted the unexpected left an impression that has remained with me vividly ever since. But this was different.
Violet and the rest of the crew rushed to the lifeboats. Having sighted a nearby island, Captain Bartlett attempts to beach the ship by driving her hard towards the shore, tragically unaware that 2 lifeboats have already been launched.
The propellers had broken the surface, and when those lifeboats were launched, the suction generated by the still-moving propellers naturally drew them into the blades, and they were hacked to bits.
Violet was in the lifeboat, and she suddenly saw everybody jumped out. And then she turned around and saw that they were headed for this propeller still churning madly in the water.
In another moment, I would be under those glittering, relentless blades, unless I looked at the equally inexorable sea, and for a fraction of a second hesitated, for I have always been afraid of water. Drowning was my one irrational fear all my life.
With the deadly blades nearly upon her, Violet jumps into the roiling sea and is immediately dragged under by the suction. A lifeboat strikes Violet in the head, cracking her skull. Dazed, the terrified nurse breathes in water and begins to sink towards a watery grave. At the last moment, Violet brushes against the arm of another survivor, who drags her to the surface.
Just as life seemed nothing but a whirling, choking ache, I rose to the light of day, my nose barely above the little lapping waves. I opened my eyes on an indescribable scene of slaughter, which made me shut them again to keep it out.
Remarkably, only 30 of the more than 1,000 people on board perish, most of them horribly torn apart by the churning propellers.
One of the lucky things about the Britannic was that she was outbound on her way to Mudros to pick up the wounded. If she'd struck it coming home with a ship full of wounded men, it would have made the Titanic look like a picnic.
Even as the survivors of Britannic are being plucked from the Mediterranean, rumors and questions begin swirling around the wreck. For all of the improvements made in Britannic's hull, She sinks in only 55 minutes, almost 3 times faster than Titanic. Why did she go down so fast? And more importantly, what caused the initial explosion?
Rumors flew around all over the place that she was an ambush victim of a German torpedo. Remember, the Lusitania had just been lost the year before. The Germans had promised not to continue torpedoing ships, but who was going to believe the bloody Hun?
Charges erupt from both sides. The naval correspondent of the Times accuses Germany of sinking the Britannic to get rid of a vessel likely to be a formidable competitor for passenger traffic after the war. Berlin angrily responds by suggesting that Britannic was transporting combat medical personnel in defiance of the Geneva Convention.
And they'd issue a communique in the London Times to state that we did not deliberately sink the ship, but we're very suspicious about the large amount of personnel on board. It was just enough to sort of raise a few question marks in the minds of the neutral Americans.
The hastily conducted official naval inquiry does little to address the rumors. The final report states only that the effects of the explosion might have been due to either a mine or a torpedo. The probability seems to be a mine.
The report into the loss of the Britannic was less than complete if you compare it with the Titanic inquiry. The British officers investigating the loss of the ship had a number of different problems. The survivors were spread all over Athens, they were being shipped home very, very quickly, and there were very few who actually saw anything. So as a result, when the final report was published 2 days later, it was very, very basic.
Despite the simmering controversy, the wreck of Britannic soon fades from public consciousness. Pushed off the front pages of newspapers by the death of popular Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph. It will be more than 60 years before Britannic once more makes headlines and reveals the many secrets she took with her to the bottom. When we continue, the last surviving ship cannot escape the jinx of her sisters.
The Olympic was coming through fog early one morning and suddenly ran down this lightship, cut it in half.
The First World War brought a swift and dramatic end to the hospital ship Britannic, but not her last remaining sister, Olympic. In May 1918, during her 22nd successful troop-carrying mission, Olympic faces her most daunting challenge, a head-to-head confrontation with U-Boat 103. Captain Bertram Fox Hayes recalls,
"There was only one thing to do, and that was to try to ram it. He went full speed ahead and tried to escape by turning inside our circle. We put our helm hard aport again and hit him a swinging blow with our stem, which put an end to his career. I turned to Captain Thompson and, after shaking hands, said, 'Well, Thompson, there's 40 of the brutes gone to hell.'"
The Olympic has a very unique claim to fame in that she's the only major liner ever to ram and sink a German submarine.
I think it's remarkable the Olympic was able to do that crash turn and hit the submarine at all. First of all, submarines present very small targets, and moreover, Olympic was not designed to turn on a dime. They weren't warships, Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, so White Star didn't put the money into the rudder and the propeller system to get those sharp turns.
Sinking the U-boat proves a fitting end to the Grand Liner's military career. The following year, Germany surrenders and the Olympic returns to her regular transatlantic passenger route. Incredibly, joining the first-class crew once again is stewardess Violet Jessup.
The Olympic had discarded her wartime camouflage and returned from Belfast, reconditioned for North Atlantic passenger service when I rejoined her after the war.
Now after the war, she went right back to the ships, partly because the money was good, you see. So she had a very good income, and despite these horrific experiences on both Titanic and Britannic, she still kept going back to sea.
The Olympic never recaptures her pre-war popularity, but steadily continues to sail the oceans for 15 more years, living up to her nicknames, the Grand Old Lady of the North Atlantic and Old Reliable. But on May 15th, 1934, even Old Reliable cannot escape the curse of Titanic's sisters.
The Olympic, like all liners coming into New York, always in a hurry, always anxious to come as close as possible to the Nantucket Lightship because that marked the edge of the Nantucket Shoal. And if you were to the right of it, you were right. If you were the left, you were going to go on the shoal and run aground. So they used to cut it very fine.
The crew of the lightship often complains about the close calls, but nothing is done to dissuade the practice. Just a month earlier, radio operator John Perry had predicted to a friend that one of those big liners will just ride through us one of these days. Perry's prediction proved sadly prescient.
The Olympic was coming through fog early one morning and suddenly ran down this lightship, cut it in half, and killed several of the crew.
The accident proves to be the end of a star-crossed career. Caught in the midst of the Great Depression, the newly merged White Star and Cunard lines decide that the old ship is no longer profitable, and Olympic is sold as scrap the following year. It is an ignominious end for the liner once touted to be the grandest in the world.
Olympic sailed to Jarrow. Her fittings were dispersed and sold at auction, and oddly enough, a lot of her fittings didn't sell. Nobody wanted to buy things that looked like their grandmother's house.
Today, all that remains of Olympic's grand interiors are scattered pieces, like those which adorn the White Swan Hotel in Alnwick, England.
The most remarkable thing to me about actually visiting the White Swan and seeing the Olympic fittings is that they came to life. You're not looking at them in a black and white photo. There's color, there's life to it. And to sit there and think of all the people that had sat in that room, Captain Smith, and many of the people who were lost on Titanic. They sat in that room and enjoyed life. It really brought home a whole new aspect to these ships.
Violet Jessup, the only person to survive sailing on all 3 Olympic-class ships, finally leaves the sea in 1950 at the age of 63. She retires far from the coast to a quaint English cottage where she lives out her final days. Even amid such bucolic surroundings, Violet cannot escape one last eerie encounter with the curse of Titanic and her sisters.
Violet was in her cottage at night, and she said sometimes when there was a thunderstorm down the line, lightning would strike the telephone line and her phone would ring. And she said it started to ring in the middle of the night. She got up and staggered into the hall where the telephone was. And a woman's voice said, "Is this Violet Jessup?" "Yes," said Violet. "Is this Violet Jessup who saved a baby on the Titanic?" "Yes, it is. Who is this calling in the middle of the night?" And the woman laughed and said, "I was that baby," and then hung up. Now, I said to her, "Violet, some children in the village playing a joke on you." And she said, "No, John, nobody had ever heard that story until I told it to you today. I've never told anybody else that story." So it's one of those mysteries we'll never solve.
When we return, modern explorers attempt to unlock the mysteries of Britannic 60 years after her demise.
One of the divers who's actually penetrated the wreck has seen a watertight door that's not completely closed.
For decades, the mysteries surrounding the sinking of Britannic continue to intrigue marine historians. In 1975, nearly 60 years after her sinking, famed oceanographer Jacques Cousteau sets out to locate the wreck of Britannic.
When Cousteau went to find the wreck, he couldn't find it. It wasn't where the Admiralty said it would be. So he had to do quite a bit of searching. It turned out that the wreck is about 8 miles from where the Admiralty said it was.
Is the misplacement of Britannic on British Admiralty charts accidental? Or could it have been done intentionally to keep something about the wreck secret? Cousteau finally locates the Britannic nearly 400 feet below the surface of the Mediterranean. He is amazed to find that the wreck lies intact on the ocean bottom. In the coming months, Cousteau's team uses the latest diving technology to explore the ghost ship.
When Cousteau went down to the wreck, he immediately discovered massive damage on the port side, adjacent to the bow, right under the well deck.
The extent and location of the destruction baffles some experts. It is much greater than would be expected from a single mine or torpedo, causing speculation that there must have been a second internal explosion. If so, that theory gives weight to the rumors that Britannic was smuggling illegal arms for the British.
I'm prepared to discuss the possibility of an explosion, if anybody can come forward with a credible explanation of what was exploding. I tend to think that what you're looking at is massive impact damage. The ship hit the bottom snub-nosed, and the steel plates simply flayed apart.
And what of the accusations that Britannic was torpedoed because she was carrying illicit troops in defiance of the Geneva Convention?
As for troops, well, that bubble was burst when the ship sank. They weren't in the survivors, and they certainly all didn't go down with the ship, so it seems she was pretty innocent of that accusation also.
In the end, the depth of Britannic's watery grave prevents the Cousteau team from completing a thorough investigation of the wreck. They depart the site with more questions raised than answered.
Because of the limitations of diving technology at the time, Cousteau was only able to spend about 5 minutes on the bottom. And for an 882-foot-long ship, you can't see much. So he didn't have the time to fully explore the wreck and see if there was anything else that could be answered.
Hoping to pick up where Cousteau had left off, a team led by Dr. Robert Ballard, famed discoverer of Titanic, returns to the site in 1995 armed with a dazzling array of new technologies.
And not only did he bring a nuclear-powered sub, he also brought 2 remotely controlled vehicles that could examine different portions of the wreck at the same time. I was fortunate to be able to have 2 dives in the NR-1, the nuclear-powered sub, to go see the Britannic with my own eyes. And it was very exciting, not only to see the ship, but to see her in such a pristine state.
In the crystal clear water, the team sets out to meticulously record the condition of Britannic. The remote cameras record many never-before-seen details of the slumbering giant. Several images reveal a large number of open portholes along the side of the ship. Historians wonder why they were left open. Could such small windows have helped bring about Britannic's rapid demise?
The portholes had been left open by the nursing staff to air out the rather stuffy wards. Had these portholes been closed, that could have been the difference between saving the ship and losing it.
Every open porthole contributes between a ton and a ton and a half of water per second. For every 150 tons of added weight, the Britannic sinks an inch. Now, you realize that not only do you have the stupendous amount of damage underwater to contend with, but now you have all the supplemental flooding from those portholes left open.
Despite their success in documenting the wreck site, one piece of evidence ultimately eludes Ballard's team. They cannot find an anchor to which a mine would have been tethered. It is the one piece of evidence which they believe could finally provide a concrete answer to the most lingering questions surrounding Britannic. Was it a mine or torpedo that sunk her?
Most of the research into the loss of the Britannic hinges more on historical documentation rather than a forensic analysis of the wreck. We know that a minefield was laid there just a few days earlier by a German mine-laying submarine, and when you go through the logs of all the submarines that would be candidates, none are in the area. So it's fairly conclusive just on the basis of documentation that it was a mine.
It's almost certain that it was a mine that sank the Britannic. The allegations for torpedo persist, but there's no real hard evidence. And therefore, a little look at the facts rather than the allegations and innuendo that surround the sinking of the ship seem to confirm that the Britannic was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
In recent years, improved equipment has allowed teams to actually enter and document the wreck. With each new exploration, a few more pieces of the Britannic puzzle fall into place.
One of the divers who's actually penetrated the wreck where the mine damage is has seen a watertight door that's not completely closed. Well, that's a phenomenal find because that was something we'd only been able to speculate for the last few decades, and now hopefully on the next expedition they'll be able to get in, get photographs of it, and that will be proof that the watertight doors weren't able to close and that contributed to the loss of the ship.
Some researchers believe that the sea will never give up all of her secrets, and the truth behind stories of Britannic and her sisters Olympic and Titanic will forever remain shrouded in mystery. Others counter that the truth is already known, that the 3 ships are just unfortunate victims in man's unrelenting battle to tame the implacable sea.
I'm afraid there's no hidden revelation about Britannic. She struck a mine and went to the bottom. Titanic is another case in point where they look for things that somehow pinpoint a hidden tragedy, a hidden dilemma, a hidden failing that nobody suspected before. She struck an iceberg and sank. That was it. Just as the Britannic did. She struck a mine and went to the bottom. And to think that the ships were jinxed, I think is not correct. I mean, I don't subscribe to that theory. My theory is that 3 ships happened to meet unkind ends.
It spread throughout India, Asia, and the Middle East. There was no way to fight it. It was an invisible enemy. Over 600 years ago, the Black Death split Europe in half. The ones who died and the ones who awaited their turn. The Plague, Monday night at 8 on History International.